Hi, I'm Jennifer from Shabby Fabrics. This is a series about binding a quilt. This is one of the most basic and fundamental things that you need to know if you're going to be embarking on the quilting journey. So there's a couple different approaches. I want to share with you what I know, and of course there's always new things emerging. I'm always looking for new techniques to share with you. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so when I do have new ideas, new projects, you'll be one of the first to know. Now, a binding of a quilt, just to define that for you, there's the top of the quilt, there is the middle of a quilt, and I've kind of got a profile of one so you can kind of see these different, the anatomy, I guess I would call it, of a quilt. The top of the quilt, the batting, and then the backing. Here we have a pieced quilt, beautiful piecing and applique. In the middle of it, there's a batting, usually a cotton batting, maybe a poly cotton blend. That's your decision depending on how much loft you want. And then your backing fabric. Of course, you have kind of a quilt sandwich is what some people call it. And now you need to enclose that. That's where binding comes in. Now, one of the first things about binding is what color should I be choosing? That's a very important decision because it's like a frame of a picture. It's the end of the quilt. And so I do hope you'll give it some consideration. Sometimes you might want to pick something that it really is kind of a splash. It has a strong impact of color on the edge. And other times you want it to be very much downplayed, where you want the focus to be on the center of the quilt. Sometimes for binding, if I want the focus to really be on the center of a quilt, I will choose a binding fabric that is the same exact fabric as my outer border. This is the outer border of a quilt. And that way the quilt kind of just ends, but it doesn't have a ta-da at the end of it. So give that some thought. I chose a gingham here because I had used some ginghams throughout the quilt and I just thought it was kind of a sweet country look. Now sometimes you might want to have like a candy cane stripe, and we'll talk about that later, and that's kind of a bias cut. That's another video altogether. I'll touch on that just a little bit here, but now that you know what a binding is and its purpose, what size do you cut strips to? And that's how binding is created, usually is from strips. There's something else called self-binding, again in a separate video later on, and that's why you really do want to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss all these different techniques and these different things I'll be sharing with you. And of course, that's always free to watch at your leisure 24/7. I like 2.5 inch wide binding strips. Some people prefer 2 1/4. I like 2.5 because it's a little easier for me to go ahead and go all the way around the edge. We will get in later in subsequent videos on the different approaches to even how to get the binding started on a quilt. What I'm going to share with you today is how to splice strips, and when do you cut up the width of the fabric, and when do you cut on what's called bias, or on the 45 degree. That's going to give you that candy cane stripe. Again, I mentioned I like 2.5 inch strips. And in this quilt, for example, as you can imagine, I probably used 3 to 4 strips to get around the perimeter of this quilt. So that's one thing you're first going to want to figure out is how do you calculate that? I basically take the perimeter of a quilt and add about 8 to 10 inches to that because I do what's called the mitered corner, again covered in another video. That's going to give you a measurement. So let's say that the perimeter of this quilt was 80 inches. I'm going to add, let's just add 10 for even numbers. I'm at 90 inches. And I know from a strip of fabric, I have about 40 inches of usable width. So that's going to be 90 divided by 4. It's going to be 2 and some change. So that's going to put you at about 3 strips. So these 2 strips, for example, of course, I would have cut 3. I just have 2. I'm going to show you how to splice those. Now, I realized if you're admiring this quilt, this is not a Shabby Fabrics design. This is another designer, and I recolored it with the Welcome Home fabrics. This is available as a kit. So the main thing I brought it out was to show you the binding, but I realized you might fall in love with that quilt, and it's really a sweet one. How do you bind, or how do you splice strips? There's a couple different approaches. There's something called the butt joint, which works really well for stripes like this. All right. where one strip is literally butted up against the next. And that's very easy to see why that's logical. Now, of course, you've got your selvage on there. Go ahead and just take that away. And on this side as well. In fact, I'm just going to get rid of that whole little fold right there. So as I am matching this up, I want it such that you don't notice where the transition from one strip to the other is. So I will, in the case of a butt joint, I'm going to just adjust this so that when I stitch this here and I turn that open, it is a continuous, it looks like it's one continuous piece of fabric. So in this case, with a stripe, keep in mind you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if I'm going to stitch these together here, and I will, my goal is that one strip just continues to the next and you don't even notice that they're joined. I'm going to go right down the middle of that stripe. I have one stripe stacked on top of the other. I'm going to go right exactly on top of that. When I come back, I'm going to show you how to clean up that edge and what that's going to look like, and you won't even really be able to tell where one strip ends and the other begins. So I stacked the one stripe on top of the other and sewed right down the middle of that lane. Now I'm going to take this to my pressing mat and press this open. Okay, so if I didn't like that, see that stripe is a little bit thicker than the other ones. I could seam rip that or trim it off and chew it again. I feel like that's reasonable. I'm going to go with that. I've once had a friend tell me at a quilting retreat, if you can't notice something on a quilt on a galloping horse, don't change it. I love that person because a lot of times when I'm in that decision of should I seam rip that, I think about the galloping horse. Nope, I'm gonna leave that in my quilt. So just that was a really cool thing that my friend told me. You know, and that just kind of gave me the blessing that quilts aren't perfect. We aren't perfect. It's just do the best that you can. I think that's reasonable. Plus, keep in mind that the binding strip will actually be folded in half. And you really cannot tell that there's a union right there. Now, that butt joint is something I rarely use because on other strips, such as the floral, it's better to do a splice on the watch what I mean, on the 45. Again, I'm going to go ahead and trim off that selvage. Now, with one strip right side up, and I use my mat so that I'm lined up and I'm absolutely square. You're going to want to use a marking tool for this. Let me trim off these selvages as well. And you can use a ruler or just kind of get in there. Now, 90 degrees. I'm going to do a crisscross here. So this strip is running along the horizontal lines on my mat. This other strip is running along the vertical lines. And I try to hold that steady. Any color friction pen or other marking tool will work. This is where I love to use the small Omni Grip ruler. You can imagine bringing out a big ruler at this point is not helpful. It's just creating more of an obstacle course. From this corner to this corner, I'm going to mark. Hold that steady. Get some pins out. Have I tried to move this directly to the sewing machine without pinning? Of course. Does it end up shifting on me? Of course it does. That one's bent. Let's not use that. Just pin because you really want those that splice to be a good splice, and the strips are looking really very professional. Okay, so I'm going to gather that up. We'll bring that to the sewing machine. And we're just going to straight stitch from that one corner to the other corner. Now, I don't have my glasses on, so I'm going to do the best I can right now. I mostly see the line. All right. Some people right away take the pins out and they go ahead and trim. I want to look at that strip, make sure I'm happy with what I've done, and I don't need to seam rip it back out before I trim. So let's have a look at that. The goal is when you open this up, it just keeps going like this is in line with this, and it looks like we've done a good job. So now I do feel confident to go ahead and let's just bring that 1/4 inch in there and let's trim that. And we'll bring this to here. And I like to press the seam open. Don't be tempted to press things to the side, because then you're just adding a lot of bulk. There's already going to be bulk because the strip is going to actually fold it in half and pressed. So go ahead and open that up. And now you have a nice join right there. And my experience has been, if you're wondering, why don't you just do a butt joint? The butt joint with a fabric that doesn't have something like a stripe or a reason where a butt joint makes more sense, it just seems like it sticks out like a sore thumb. It seems to be more prominent to me. So I'm holding that up now. I don't know if you can even see where that joint is. It's very unnoticeable. Now at this point, with whether you do a butt joint or you do the 45, you will take your binding to your pressing mat, and with the wrong sides together, you'll simply fold in half and press all the way down. So that's how you prepare the binding for the next phase. In subsequent videos, I will show you different approaches of how you get the binding on the quilt, depending on the look that you're going for. So join me in the next videos on the binding, and I'll show you how to actually put that on your quilt and finish it up.